Hi, everyone. This is Katerina Garavito with Rise. We've recently had a lot of inquiries surrounding mentorship, especially during the change that has been taking place during this pandemic. So we decided to reach out to one of our board members, Dale Sherman, who is the Assistant General Counsel over at Allstate Insurance, due to his experience with mentorship. Thank you so much for joining us, Dale.
It's my privilege. Thank you.
So how do you feel about mentorship?
I think mentorship is critical, and it plays a critical role in the development of all people, not just in the workplace, but in everyday life as well. It certainly benefited me throughout my career, and it's benefited me throughout my life. I had a lot of experiences, growing up that I didn't think of at the time as a mentor-mentee relationship, but they absolutely were. And, they helped me develop and made me who I am.
So you mentioned having a mentor early in your career. Do you have some stories about that?
I had some very good mentors, and they didn't necessarily label themselves that way at the time. But I am a trial lawyer by trade. That's how I came up in the business. That's how I started to, make a career for myself, was as a trial lawyer. And it's like so many professions is an apprenticeship, right? So I, was somewhat of an apprentice to a bunch of these other trial lawyers, and I would just soak up everything I can learn from them. Some of it was visual and observational. I would go to court, watch what they did, ask them a million questions afterwards, and some of it was, storytelling, and they would tell stories, and they would tell me stories about tactics they employed, why they employed them, and I would, learn from those things. Sometimes I learned from their mistakes. The best mistakes to learn from are somebody else's, and sometimes I would learn from their successes, and I would borrow whatever worked well for them or whatever didn't work as well for them and try to employ that in how I approached my craft.
So with having some great mentors in your career, have you taken up mentoring other professionals?
Absolutely. And I think for one thing, it's great to show generosity and pass it on. And, when you go from, being an apprentice to, quote unquote, being a master, right? Someone who's learned the skills over the course of, in my case, of a couple decades or more, you need to pass those on. You have an obligation, I think, a moral obligation, ethical obligation to pass those on. Plus, you work for a big company, and, by the time you retire, you need someone else who's going to be running that company and having success with it. So you have to pass on all those skills, and those people can do what I did. They can learn from my mistakes, they can learn from my successes, and everything in between, and bring those into their career and to develop themselves, and bring them into their life to develop themselves as well. So I mentor a lot. I have a lot of mentees, sometimes formally, sometimes informally. But I try to be as generous as I can with my time, and my calendar open to anybody who wants to grab time on it to set up a session where we can talk.
It's amazing. So you mentioned setting up time in your calendar. Normally you have, Joe down the hall that you can just grab a cup of coffee with. Now we're in this virtual world. How do you think people can keep their mentor-mentee relationships virtually?
I think it's, on the one hand, it's more challenging given the environment that we're in right now, but on the other hand, it's really not that challenging, right? So, for a long time, a lot of the people that I've led worked out of other locations, right? So at one point, I think 90% of my team was dispersed around the country. So I was very much used to engaging them virtually, engaging them through Skype or through Zoom or through conference calls or whatever it was. I do prefer the video conferencing though, because so much can get lost in body language, right? You lose tone, you can lose a lot of meaning by not having a face-to-face, especially if you're trying to persuade somebody of something, right? So, or you're trying to change manage, you can look in people's faces and see, okay, are they buying what I'm selling or not, right? Have I convinced them that this is a good idea or not? Are they going to come along with me for this journey, or are they not ready yet? You can lose a lot of that when you're just kind of ranting into the ether on a conference call and you hear crickets on the other end. You don't know, because you can't see the faces. You don't know what they're thinking. And even then, you don't always know what they're thinking, but it gives you some indication. You brought up a great point, which is that, right now, we don't have the luxury of being able to walk down the hall, grab coffee with somebody, make plans for lunch with someone. You can really, have that mentor-mentee relationship, kind of pick their brain, ask them questions. You can still do that, but you had to be much more intentional about it, much more purposeful. So we have to schedule this kind of time. And anyone who's losing that, I think it's important just to set up check-ins with people that you would normally, not necessarily have business dealings with, but those same people that you grab lunch with or grab coffee with, start setting up check-ins with them just so you don't lose touch, because relationships take a long time to build, and they can degrade in a very short period of time just through neglect and just through not having those conversations. So I encourage everyone to set up those check-ins and do them on a recurring basis so they're not just kind of accidental. And I think the people on the other end will be very receptive to that.
You mentioned, having face-to-face, and with technology, we can do these Zoom calls or WebEx calls. Have you seen situations where maybe the roles were reversed with mentor-mentee, maybe surrounding technology?
Yeah, absolutely. And not just for technology. So I think a core principle for me is, when it comes to mentoring, and really when it comes to everything I do, is humility, right? Be humble in all of your dealings. And when it comes to being a mentor, you have to be humble as well. Someone's not coming to you because they think you have all the answers. You probably have a few more answers than they do, but you have to come in being ready to learn as well, not just teach, right? Not just share, but also hear what they have to say, because undoubtedly, if you take a humble approach, they have a great deal to teach you. They can come up with a different approach to something that you hadn't considered, because you thought you'd been down that path and had that figured out, but the environment around you changed and you no longer have that answer. So a lot of times it's technology. So you take someone who's more tenured, like me, mentoring someone who's less tenured, and they might have technology solutions that I hadn't contemplated, or a better way to do something through technology. So that's one way that I become a mentee in my relationships. But also, I learn a lot from mentees, especially less tenured mentees, just about communication. So, you can't paint with too broad a brush about cohorts and generations and things like that. But I think as a general rule, the more tenured people and less tenured people have different expectations when it comes to the workplace and how they're going to be communicated with, what's going to be communicated to them, how they get engaged, how they get recognized, all those different things. And I've learned so much just from opening my ears and becoming the mentee of my mentee, for that part of the conversation, where I can get new perspectives. And I think it all comes from a place of humility. So the tables turn very quickly, and you can be the mentor or the mentee several times over in the course of 1.5 hour conversation.
Wow. Well, I've heard a lot of people mention that younger people in the professional world are at an advantage during this time because of technology in distant communication. So I personally feel comfortable using technology to communicate. And I know that some of my mentors that I have feel comfortable using it as well. So it's nice to see that other people out there want to use a face-to-face means of communication. Mm-hmm. So do you think that we're going to need more ways to collaborate and network to fill that human void in the future?
I think so. I think humans are innately social creatures, and they always want to find a way to socialize and bring themselves together in a meaningful way. And you've seen how people have adapted, right? You've seen the drive-by birthday parties, and you've seen the virtual graduations, all these great things that show up as memes and show up as videos that people watch on YouTube. So people are already adapting, but I think some of it is really means being more and more intentional about how we get together, when we get together, those check-ins I talked about before, the things that we took for granted, right? Being able to just see someone every day and stop by their desk, and if they were available and you were available, you can go hang out for a while. We don't have that luxury anymore, so we have to do a little more scheduling, be a little more thoughtful about it, and a little more intentional about it. But I think that those collaborations will start to evolve more naturally. And right now, it's going to feel like very forced and feel like a lot of work, but eventually it's just going to be kind of reflexive that, yeah, of course I'll set up regular time with that person, because I get a lot from that relationship, and hopefully they get a lot from working and meeting with me as well.
So what would you say to more tenured or experienced professionals that want to take on a mentorship-like role in the workforce? What can they do?
Just go do it, right? So just volunteer, make it known that you're willing to mentor people, because it is intimidating. If you're a less tenured person, it's got to be a little bit intimidating to approach someone who's very, very much a stranger to you. And hey, will you be my mentor? Right? I mean, it's awkward, right? So if you make it known that you're willing to be a mentor and you're willing to mentor anybody who you feel is in need of your assistance, then I think they'll come to you in droves, right? Especially if you're generous with your time and you're a good listener and you really do give, honest and practical guidance. So I would say also to the prospective mentor, find mentees if you can. If you have a role in the selection process, find people who don't have your background. Find people who don't look like you, right? Find people who come from a whole different perspective. And that way you have the benefit of potential learning from them as well, right? So you get different thoughts on things from a whole different set of life experiences. And you can share yours with them, they can share theirs with you, and both of you are the richer because of it.
So that's putting a lot of the control onto the mentor and the mentee. How can companies help their employees feel more connected and maybe create some of these relationships?
Well, I think companies are doing a nice job in adapting at the macro level, right? So you see a lot of virtual town halls, a lot of, company-wide communications that happen, maybe more written company-wide communications, and a lot of things, with sort of the theme that, we'll get through this together, that kind of stuff, which is all very genuine and very sincere, I'm sure. But the two most important relationships to an employee, one is going to be their relationship with their immediate manager.
Right.
And the other one's going to be their relationship with their peers, right? So what companies really can do if they want to have meaningful breakthroughs on those relationships and maintaining them, is to encourage managers to have very frequent check-ins with their employees virtually, right? Because again, what we used to take for granted, I can just stop by my boss's desk, no big deal, or I'll find my boss in the break room. You can't do that anymore. So I think it's incumbent upon the leaders to reach out and set up those meetings all the time, because if you just set up meetings when you need to, they can become kind of stilted and kind of sterile. But if you have meetings all the time, they can have a more social aspect to them, which is necessary. And, so it's not just about, is today's report going to be on time, but it's also going to be, how was Tommy's soccer game, or how did Sarah do at softball? And in those meaningful conversations that help cement relationships where you get to know them as human beings, not just as employees, and those have to happen more frequently. And also to foster an environment where employees can have peer-to-peer connections too. So whether it's a Zoom happy hour or just any kind of meeting where maybe the manager just opens it up and then the manager steps out and lets people just hang out and talk about issues. Whatever it is, anything that companies can do to encourage and foster an environment where those peer-to-peer relationships thrive and the managerial relationships, the direct managerial relationships thrive with their employees, that's always going to be a win.
So as we see out the remaining 2020 year, do you think that mentorship is going to continue to evolve?
Inevitably. It's already evolved, right? But I think where it's probably going to evolve next, or at least over the next 6 months, if things stay as they are, right? If things return to kind of how they were back in January and February, then maybe the evolution is not so severe. But if we're still at a distance for the foreseeable future, then some of the things I already talked about with being more purposeful and intentional about setting up check-ins, setting up socializing, setting up mentoring conversations, and having those on the calendar versus just letting them happen spontaneously, that's probably the next evolution. And there's also going to be, I think, more and more emphasis on mentoring just in general, to the extent that it goes to that apprenticeship environment that I talked about, where you have someone who's been there a long time, they've really learned the craft, and they pass it on, among other things, through mentorship. And not just the hard skills of the job, right? But also the soft skills, mentoring about leadership, mentoring about influencing, about change management, about empathy. And some of that comes through observation of your mentor, but a lot of it just comes through discussions, and especially discussions that set up scenarios, right? You ask your mentee what's been their biggest challenge in the last week. They tell you what it was, and then you find out from them, How do they, approach it? What would they have done differently? And then you can share your stories about how you approach something similar and what your results were. And maybe their results were even better than yours. And that goes back to the mentor becoming the mentee, right? That happens that way too. So it will evolve, but not as much as we might think, especially if things go back to normal.
Probably just the way in which we do it, but not the content of what's being discussed.
Yep. And of course, the more you do it, the better you get at it, whether you're a
Right.
mentee or a mentor. Mentees who have lots of mentors get better and better about asking questions, about seeking help, about seeking advice, and they're, more and more brave about, just flat out coming out and asking for guidance, or asking tough questions. Well, why would you have done it that way? I understand that's how you had that experience and you took that approach, but why? And you can have those conversations, and everyone will get better at it by doing it more. And I think mentoring is great. So if you're not a mentor and you're in that point in your career where you can mentor others, go out and do it. I strongly suggest it. Even if you're a mentee and you haven't taken on a potential mentee and you haven't taken on a mentor, go out and find one or more to help you, because there's lots of different perspectives and you will benefit greatly by having lots of different perspectives.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been a
And
pleasure.
I appreciate the RISE community for being involved as well. We actually will be announcing our RISE winners soon this summer. Please look out for that. Thank you again, and we'll chat soon.
And if you're not a member, RISE is free to join, isn't it?
Right, it is. Thank you.
All right. Well, join RISE. It's a great organization.